Imagine the unthinkable. Two global giants, the United States and China, locked in an all-out, no-holds-barred conflict. What if the USA and China fought an all-out war, and how would this reshape our world forever? The very idea of a full-scale conflict between the United States and China conjures images of apocalyptic devastation, a cataclysm that would dwarf any previous global war. This isn't just about two nations. It's about two vastly different systems, economies, and ideologies clashing on a scale never before witnessed. The ripple effects wouldn't just be felt, they would fundamentally alter human civilization. Consider the initial flashpoint. Would it be a struggle over Taiwan, an escalation in the South China Sea, or a cyber attack that spirals out of control? The trigger might be precise, but the resulting conflagration would be anything but contained. The opening salvos would likely involve massive cyber attacks, targeting critical infrastructure, financial systems, and military networks on both sides, aiming to blind and paralyze the enemy before a shot is physically fired. How would the world react as digital warfare plunges major nations into chaos? The immediate military engagements would be unprecedented. Naval forces, particularly in the Pacific, would be at the forefront. Carrier strike groups, advanced submarines, and vast fleets would become targets in a high-stakes chess match for control of vital sea lanes. Air superiority would be fiercely contested, with stealth fighters, advanced missile systems, and drone swarms dominating the skies. Would either side achieve a decisive early advantage, or would it be a brutal war of attrition? Space would become a new battlefield. Satellites providing communication, navigation, and intelligence would be vulnerable to anti-satellite weapons, creating a cascade of debris that could render large swaths of orbit unusable. This Pearl Harbor in space would cripple modern military operations and have devastating civilian consequences, disrupting everything from GPS to weather forecasting. What would it mean to fight a war blind or in the dark? Economically, the global system would collapse almost instantly. The interconnectedness of the US and Chinese economies means that a war between them would be a war on global commerce itself. Supply chains would shatter, stock markets would crash, and international trade would grind to a halt. Essential goods, from microchips to medicines, would become scarce, triggering a worldwide recession far deeper and more prolonged than any in history. How would billions of people survive the sudden cessation of global trade? Alliances would be severely tested. Nations would be forced to choose sides, or attempt a perilous neutrality that might satisfy neither. NATO, already under strain, would face an existential crisis. Countries in Asia, particularly those in China's immediate vicinity, would be drawn into the conflict, directly or indirectly, facing impossible choices and immense pressure. Could any alliance withstand such seismic pressures? The human cost would be unimaginable. Beyond military casualties, civilian populations would be at risk from long-range missile strikes, cyber disruptions affecting critical services, and the widespread economic collapse leading to famine and social unrest. Modern warfare, even with precision weapons, is never truly precise when scaled to this magnitude. How would the global population cope with a humanitarian crisis on an unprecedented scale? Technological innovation, once a driver of global progress, would be solely dedicated to destruction. Scientific breakthroughs, from AI to biotechnology, would be weaponized, pushing the boundaries of warfare into terrifying new realms. The race for ever more lethal capabilities would consume immense resources, diverting talent and capital from addressing pressing global challenges. What dark frontiers of technology would this war unleash? The political landscape of the world would be irrevocably altered. Regardless of who won, or even if it ended in a stalemate, the existing international order would be shattered beyond repair. New power vacuums would emerge, new alliances would form from the ashes, and the concept of global governance would need to be entirely reimagined. Could any lasting peace ever truly be forged after such a conflict? Nuclear weapons, the ultimate deterrent, would cast a terrifying shadow over every decision. The risk of escalation, even accidental, to tactical or strategic nuclear exchange would be ever present. The very survival of humanity would hang by a thread, contingent on restraint that might prove impossible in the fog of an all-out war. Would humanity be able to pull back from the brink, or would the unthinkable happen? Environmental devastation would follow. Beyond the direct destruction of military targets, the sheer scale of industrial output for war, the burning of resources, and potential attacks on energy infrastructure would have catastrophic ecological consequences, impacting climate, ecosystems, and human health for generations. What kind of planet would be left for survivors? Information warfare would be as critical as kinetic warfare. Both nations would wage a relentless campaign to control narratives, sow disinformation, and undermine the morale of the enemy's population and allies. Trust in media, governments, and even facts themselves would erode, creating a pervasive fog of uncertainty. How would truth survive such an onslaught? Internal dissent and civil unrest could destabilize both superpowers. The economic strain, loss of life, and disruption to daily life could lead to widespread discontent, challenging the legitimacy of governments and potentially sparking internal conflicts or revolutions. Could either government maintain control of its own population under such immense pressure? The nature of global security would be fundamentally reshaped. Even if direct fighting ceased, the world would remain a far more dangerous place, characterized by heightened distrust, vast arsenals of advanced weapons, and a pervasive sense of insecurity. The concept of peace dividends would be a distant memory. Would perpetual conflict become the new normal? Refugee crises on an unprecedented scale would emerge. Millions would be displaced by fighting, economic collapse, and environmental hazards, fleeing across borders that might no longer exist in any meaningful way. International aid organizations would be overwhelmed, if they could even function. How would the world absorb such a massive human migration? The psychological impact on survivors would be profound. Generations would be traumatized by the experience, living in a world scarred by war, scarcity, and the ever-present threat of renewed conflict. Hope for a brighter future might be extinguished for many. What kind of mental and emotional legacy would this war leave? Innovation, while weaponized, would also be directed towards survival. Technologies for resilience, localized production, and autonomous systems might accelerate out of sheer necessity, as nations scramble to adapt to a world without global supply chains. Would this lead to fragmented, self-sufficient pockets, or a new kind of global cooperation? The role of international law and human rights would be severely diminished, if not entirely abandoned, as nations prioritize survival and military objectives above all else. Atrocities, war crimes, and violations of civilian protections would likely become commonplace, with little to no accountability. What would be left of our shared moral framework? The global arms race, already intense, would reach fever pitch among remaining nations. Fearing vulnerability in a post-conflict world, every country capable of doing so would seek to arm itself to the teeth, further increasing global instability and the risk of future conflicts. Would disarmament ever again be a viable goal? The very concept of a world power might be redefined. The war could exhaust both the US and China so thoroughly that neither emerges truly victorious, leaving a fragmented, chaotic global landscape ripe for the rise of entirely new, unexpected regional powers. Would the world become truly multipolar, or simply descent into anarchy? The aftermath would be a struggle for definition. Who controls the narrative? Who gets to write the history books? The victors, if any, would attempt to impose their version of events, but the sheer scale of suffering and destruction would make any triumphalism ring hollow for many. Whose truth would prevail in a world so utterly broken? The potential for a dark age of technological regression is real. The destruction of infrastructure, the loss of skilled labor, and the collapse of scientific collaboration could set humanity back decades, or even centuries, in terms of technological advancement and global knowledge. How much of our accumulated progress would simply be lost? The long-term geopolitical consequences are almost impossible to predict. Would Russia seize an opportunity to expand its influence? Would Europe struggle for relevance? Would new coalitions emerge from the chaos, forming regional blocs with entirely new political and economic structures? What new maps would be drawn? The ultimate question remains: could humanity recover from such a conflict? The resilience of the human spirit is undeniable, but the scale of destruction, loss of life, and damage to the planet could push our species to its absolute limits. What kind of future, if any, could possibly emerge from the ashes? This hypothetical war is not just a military exercise. It's a profound thought experiment about the interconnectedness of our world and the catastrophic consequences of its breakdown. It forces us to examine the value of peace, the fragility of global systems, and the shared responsibility we all bear for preventing such a nightmare scenario. What lessons, if any, can we learn from imagining the worst? The sheer scale of the potential devastation serves as a stark warning. The economic, environmental, and human costs would be so immense that even the concept of victory becomes meaningless. There would be no winners, only degrees of loss. Is such a conflict truly winnable by any standard? The scenario compels us to appreciate the complex dance of diplomacy, deterrence, and cooperation that, however imperfect, has maintained a fragile peace between major powers for decades. It highlights the immense value of preventing such a conflict, rather than contemplating its aftermath. What price are we willing to pay for peace? Ultimately, the thought of the USA and China engaging in all-out war is a journey into humanity's darkest potential. It's a reminder of the destructive power we wield and the interconnected fate that binds us all. It forces us to confront not just the enemy we might face, but the very nature of conflict itself. The world would change irreversibly, not just politically or economically, but morally and spiritually. The scars would run deep, altering the collective consciousness of humanity for generations. What kind of world would we inhabit, and what would it mean to be human in its shadow? The question isn't just if it could happen, but what would be left if it did. The thought experiment concludes not with answers, but with a renewed sense of urgency. The price of such a war is simply too high. What if the USA and China fought an all-out war? The answer, terrifyingly, is a world fundamentally broken, a future irrevocably altered, and a humanity pushed to its absolute brink.